Evelyn Carter's hands trembled as she stared at the spreadsheet that could end her life. The numbers didn't lie. Millions in untraceable funds, shell companies, patterns that screamed organized crime. But that wasn't what made her heart race. It was the pregnancy test hidden in her desk drawer and the growing secret beneath her tailored jacket. 7 months working for Marco DeLuca's empire. 5 months hiding a truth that made her the most vulnerable person in the room. One audit away from exposure. One mistake away from losing everything. If you want to know how far desperation can push someone, hit that like button, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay with me until the end of this story. What? The fluorescent lights of Carter and Associates hummed their monotonous song as Evelyn saved the file and closed her laptop with hands that had learned to hide their shaking. 11:47 p.m. The downtown Chicago office was empty except for the security guard making his rounds 3 floors below and the secrets she carried, both the ones in encrypted files and the one growing inside her body. She pressed a palm against her abdomen, feeling the subtle swell beneath the loose blouse she'd started wearing 2 months ago. 18 weeks. Maybe 19. She'd stopped counting the exact days because counting made it real, and real meant making decisions she wasn't ready to face. The numbers on her screen had been simpler, cold, factual, damning. DeLuca Import Solutions had hired Carter and Associates 6 weeks ago for what should have been a straightforward audit. Verify their books, ensure compliance, provide the clean bill of health they needed for expansion into West Coast markets. Standard corporate due diligence. Evelyn had taken the assignment because the fee was substantial and because numbers never lied to her the way people did. Except these numbers told a story that made her skin crawl. She pulled her jacket from the back of her chair, the tailored navy blazer that had fit perfectly when she'd bought it in January. Now it strained slightly at the buttons, the fabric pulling in ways that would soon become obvious to anyone who looked closely enough. She'd already moved to the next size up in pants, wearing them low on her hips and covering the elastic waistband with long shirts and strategic layering. 5 months of hiding. 5 months of morning sickness suppressed with ginger tea and sheer willpower. 5 months of declining lunch invitations and happy hour drinks, of making excuses and maintaining the carefully constructed fiction that Evelyn Carter was exactly who she'd always been. Brilliant, focused, untouchable, and entirely self-sufficient. The truth was messier. The truth involved a conference in Miami, a hotel bar, a tax attorney with kind eyes, and a wedding ring he'd failed to mention until morning. The truth involved a positive pregnancy test, 3 ignored phone calls, and a Facebook profile that revealed a wife, 2 kids, and a lie that Evelyn had been stupid enough to believe for exactly 8 hours. She'd deleted his number, blocked his emails, decided that some mistakes were hers to handle alone. Her phone buzzed against the desk, the vibration sharp in the silent office. Unknown number. She let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with her heart climbing into her throat. Ms. Carter. The voice was smooth, professional, and carefully neutral. This is James Chen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, White Collar Crime Division. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss your current client engagement with DeLuca Import Solutions. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. This is a matter of significant urgency. Evelyn deleted the message with shaking fingers and sat down hard in her chair. FBI. Of course, because the numbers she'd found weren't just irregular, they were evidence. Shell companies in the Caymans, invoices that didn't match shipping manifests, payments coded as consulting fees and logistics coordination that lined up perfectly with dates she'd cross-referenced against news reports of territorial disputes between rival operations. Marco DeLuca wasn't just running an import business, he was running an empire, and she'd just spent 6 weeks documenting exactly how. Her laptop chimed, an encrypted message through the client portal. Need updated projections by Friday. Can you meet tomorrow, 2 p.m.? My office. M. DeLuca Evelyn's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Every instinct screamed at her to decline, to finish the audit remotely, to maintain professional distance from a man whose business practices ranged from questionable to criminal. But declining meant questions, meant drawing attention to her discomfort, meant potentially signaling that she'd found something worth hiding from. She typed her response with the practiced efficiency that had made her one of the youngest senior accountants at Carter and Associates. Confirmed. See you at 2.
I.
The DeLuca building occupied a prime corner of the financial district, all glass and steel, and the kind of understated wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Evelyn signed in at the lobby desk, accepted her visitor badge, and tried to ignore the way the security guard's eyes lingered on her midsection. She'd worn her most structured jacket, the one with the peplum waist that disguised rather than revealed. Her hair was pulled back in a neat twist, minimal makeup, professional armor, carefully constructed. The elevator climbed to the 23rd floor in silence. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that looked like it belonged in an art gallery. Marble floors, contemporary sculptures, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the Chicago skyline. "Ms. Carter," the receptionist smiled warmly. "Mr. DeLuca is expecting you. Conference room 3, straight back and to your left." Evelyn had been here twice before, once for the initial contract meeting, once for a progress update. Both times, Marco DeLuca had been exactly what she expected from his reputation. Young for someone controlling this much territory, sharp-eyed and sharper dressed, with the kind of focused intensity that made people nervous even when he was being perfectly polite. She found him in the conference room, standing at the windows with his back to the door, phone pressed to his ear. He held up one finger, 1 minute, without turning around. "I don't care what Castellano thinks he's entitled to," Marco said, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "The waterfront route is ours. Has been for 2 years. If he wants to renegotiate territory, he can schedule a proper meeting instead of sending his people to make implied threats." A pause. "No. Tell him exactly that, word for word." He ended the call and turned, the afternoon light catching the sharp planes of his face. Mid-30s, Evelyn guessed. Italian heritage obvious in the dark hair and darker eyes, and the kind of bone structure that would photograph well and intimidate better. He wore his power the way other men wore cologne. Subtle, until you got close enough to notice. "Evelyn," he gestured to the conference table. "Thank you for coming on short notice." "Of course." She set her laptop bag on the table, maintaining the professional distance that had served her well for 6 weeks. "You mentioned needing updated projections?" "Among other things." Marco pulled out a chair, waiting until she sat before taking his own seat across from her. Old school manners from a man whose business was decidedly new school. "How's the audit progressing?" "On schedule." Evelyn opened her laptop, pulling up the sanitized version of her findings, the one that documented the legitimate side of DeLuca Import Solutions without touching the irregularities she'd found. "Revenue streams are strong. Your expansion into pharmaceuticals has good margins. The shipping contracts you've secured with overseas manufacturers are competitive." "But?" She met his eyes. "I didn't say there was a but." "You didn't have to." Marco leaned back in his chair, studying her with the kind of attention that made her acutely aware of every tell, every micro-expression, every secret she was trying to keep. "You're very good at your job, Ms. Carter. One of the best forensic accountants in the city, according to my research. You see patterns other people miss. So when you sit across from me and recite the sanitized version of my books, I know you're choosing what not to say." Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs. "I document what I find. That's my job." "And what have you found?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications she wasn't ready to unpack. "Exactly what you hired me to find," she said carefully. "A business with strong fundamentals and significant growth potential. Some irregularities in historical accounting, but nothing that affects current operations." "Irregularities." Marco's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "That's diplomatic. I'm an accountant, Mr. DeLuca. Diplomacy is part of the service." "Marco," he corrected, "and I appreciate the discretion, but I need you to be direct with me. The West Coast expansion is time-sensitive. I need to know if there's anything in those books that could derail the deal." Evelyn considered her response carefully. The truth was that there were dozens of things that could derail any legitimate deal. Evidence of money laundering, suspicious transactions, connections to known criminal enterprises. But saying that out loud meant crossing a line from accountant to informant, and she had no intention of painting a target on her own back. "Every business has a past," she said finally. "What matters for your expansion is demonstrating that your current practices are clean, that you're moving in the right direction." Marco studied her for a long moment. And am I? Moving in the right direction? That's not my determination to make. But you have an opinion. I have findings. Whether they constitute the right direction depends on what direction you want to go. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or respect for the careful line she was walking. Smart, he said quietly. No wonder you've lasted this long. The comment sent ice down her spine. Lasted? Marco stood, moving to the windows. You know what I find interesting about numbers, Evelyn? They tell a story, but only if you know how to read them. Revenue, expenses, profit margins, they're all just data points until someone like you comes along and shows how they connect, how they reveal patterns. He turned back to face her. But people are harder to read than numbers. People hide things. Evelyn's hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, then froze. Marco's eyes tracked the movement, then returned to her face without comment. Everyone hides something, she said, keeping her voice steady. True. Marco returned to the table, but didn't sit. Which is why I value honesty when I can find it. You've been straightforward with me from the beginning, professional, discreet. I respect that. I'm just doing my job. And I'm just trying to do mine. He pulled a folder from the stack on the table and slid it across to her. These are the contracts for the West Coast expansion. I need you to review them, make sure everything aligns with what you've found in the audit. If there are any inconsistencies, I need to know before we move forward. Evelyn opened the folder, scanning the documents. Standard acquisition paperwork, partnership agreements, distribution contracts, all perfectly legitimate on the surface. When do you need this completed? End of the week. Can you manage that timeline? She should say no. Should create distance, finish the audit remotely, hand over her findings, and walk away before the FBI came knocking again. Should protect herself and the secret she carried from getting tangled up in whatever Marco DeLuca was trying to build, or escape from. I'll have it ready, she heard herself say. The first threat came 3 days later. Evelyn was leaving the office at 10 p.m., later than usual because she'd been reviewing the West Coast contracts with the kind of granular attention that made her eyes burn and her back ache. The parking garage was nearly empty, her footsteps echoing off concrete as she headed toward her car. She was 10 feet away when she noticed the envelope tucked under her windshield wiper. Plain manila. No markings. She looked around the garage, empty except for shadows and the distant hum of traffic from the street above. Every instinct told her not to touch it. Call building security. Call the police. But her hand was already reaching for the envelope, pulling it free, opening the unsealed flap. Inside was a single photograph. Her, leaving DeLuca's office building yesterday afternoon. The angle was from across the street, telephoto lens, the kind of surveillance work that spoke of professionals. No note, no demands, just the image and the message it carried. We're watching. Evelyn's hand shook as she pulled out her phone. She should call someone. But who? The police would ask questions she couldn't answer. The FBI would see an opportunity to flip her into an informant. Marco. She stopped herself. Marco DeLuca was a client, not a protector. Getting him involved meant admitting she'd found something worth threatening her over. Meant exposing weakness to a man whose world didn't tolerate vulnerability. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Finish the audit. Recommend against expansion. Walk away, or the next photo won't be of you alone. Evelyn stared at the message, her free hand pressing against her stomach where the baby was just beginning to make its presence known with small, fluttering movements. Not alone. The implication was clear. Someone knew. Someone had been watching closely enough to notice what she'd been so careful to hide. She deleted the text with shaking fingers, got in her car, and locked the doors. Then she sat in the darkness of the parking garage and tried to remember how to breathe. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she researched. Marco DeLuca, 34 years old, took over his father's import business at 26 when Vincent DeLuca died of a heart attack. Expanded aggressively, acquiring smaller operations, muscling into territories that had been held by established families for generations. The business press called him a ruthless entrepreneur. The crime blogs called him something else entirely. Evelyn found references to territorial disputes, to consolidation efforts, to rivals who'd either sold out or disappeared. She found connections to old money families with roots in Chicago's complicated history: the Castellanos, the Morettis, the Russos, names that appeared in society pages and police reports with equal frequency. She found absolutely no mention of violence directly connected to Marco himself. No arrests, no charges, just success that came a little too quickly and power that accumulated a little too easily. At 4 a.m., she finally admitted what she'd known since opening that envelope. She was caught in the middle of something that had nothing to do with accounting and everything to do with power, territory, and the kind of war that was fought in shadows and silence. At 4:15, she made a decision. She would finish the audit, document everything, give Marco exactly what he'd hired her for, a complete picture of his operations, legitimate and otherwise. Then she would disappear. Take the money she'd saved, move to a different city, start over somewhere nobody was watching. She had 4 months before the baby came. 4 months to plan an exit strategy that would keep them both safe. She just had to survive until then. The meeting with Marco was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. Evelyn arrived at 1:55, carrying printed copies of her completed audit and a flash drive with encrypted files. This time, Marco wasn't alone. The man standing by the window looked like he'd stepped out of a different era, 60s maybe, with steel gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. He wore an expensive suit that fit him like armor. "Evelyn Carter," Marco said. "This is Anthony Castellano." The name hit her like cold water. Castellano. The same family mentioned in Marco's phone call. The same name that appeared in her research connected to territorial disputes and implied threats. "Mr. Castellano," she managed, keeping her voice professional. "Mrs. Carter." Anthony's eyes were shrewd, measuring. "Marco speaks highly of your work. I appreciate that. He also tells me you're very thorough, that you see things other accountants miss." Evelyn set her materials on the conference table, buying herself a moment to think. "Attention to detail is essential in my field." "Indeed." Anthony moved from the window, settling into a chair with the ease of someone accustomed to controlling rooms. "Which is why I'm curious about your findings. Marco is proposing a significant expansion, one that would affect several existing arrangements. I have a vested interest in understanding the financial foundation of his operation." She looked at Marco, who gave her a slight nod. Permission or warning? Maybe both. "My audit covers the last 3 fiscal years," Evelyn began, opening her laptop. "Revenue has grown consistently, averaging 23% year over year. Current assets exceed liabilities by a comfortable margin. The business is financially sound." "And the irregularities you mentioned?" Anthony asked. Evelyn's throat went dry. She hadn't mentioned irregularities to Marco directly, only alluded to them, which meant he'd told Anthony she'd found something, which meant this meeting was a test. "Historical accounting shows some creative bookkeeping," she said carefully, "primarily in how certain transactions were categorized, revenue from various sources that wasn't always clearly labeled." "Sources," Anthony repeated. "Meaning?" "Meaning the business has multiple revenue streams, some more traditional than others." Marco spoke up. "What Ms. Carter is diplomatically saying is that my father's generation wasn't particularly concerned with documentation. Money came in, money went out, and as long as everyone got paid, nobody asked too many questions. And now?" Anthony's attention remained fixed on Evelyn. "Now the documentation is cleaner," she said. "Current practices are substantially more organized. Whether they're entirely legitimate is outside my scope of assessment. But you have an opinion." "I have findings," she corrected, echoing what she'd told Marco days earlier. "And my findings show a business that's moving toward legitimacy. Whether that transition is complete is a matter of interpretation." Anthony smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "You're very careful with your words, Ms. Carter." "I'm an accountant, Mr. Castellano. Precision is part of the job." And what do your precise findings say about Marco's ability to honor existing agreements while expanding west?" The question was a trap, and Evelyn knew it. Say yes, and she was endorsing Marco's expansion into territory that clearly overlapped with Castellano interests. Say no, and she was sabotaging her client and potentially painting a target on her own back. She chose a third option. That depends on what those existing agreements are, she said. Financially, the business can support expansion without compromising current operations. Whether that expansion aligns with other obligations is a matter of negotiation between the parties involved. Silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Anthony laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his face. "Smart woman," he said to Marco. "Where did you find her?" "Carter and Associates. They don't list her in the flashy marketing materials because she's too valuable to share." "I can see why." Anthony stood, buttoning his jacket. "Miss Carter, I appreciate your discretion and your clarity. Marco, we'll talk more about the West Coast situation, but based on what I've heard today, I'm willing to discuss terms." He left without another word, the door closing softly behind him. Evelyn waited until his footsteps faded before turning to Marco. "What was that?" "That was Anthony making sure I'm not going to destabilize the whole territory by overextending." Marco moved to the minibar tucked into the corner of the conference room, pouring 2 fingers of whiskey into a crystal glass. He held up a second glass in question. "No, thank you." The refusal was automatic, one of dozens of small lies she'd been telling for months. Marco took a sip, studying her over the rim. "You handled him well." "I told him the truth." "You told him what he needed to hear. There's a difference." He set down his glass. "Anthony Castellano controls most of the Southside operations, has for 20 years. When my father was alive, they had an arrangement. Territories stayed separate. Nobody crossed established lines. Everyone made money. Then my father died, and I inherited a business that was hemmed in on all sides by old men who expected me to stay in my lane." "And you didn't." "No," Marco agreed. "I didn't. I expanded, absorbed smaller operations, pushed into territories that had been static for decades, made enemies out of men who'd been my father's allies, including Castellano. Especially Castellano. But Anthony's smart enough to know that fighting me is expensive and cooperation is profitable. Today was him testing whether I'm serious about going legitimate, or if this is just another land grab disguised as respectability." Evelyn closed her laptop. "And what did you want him to conclude?" "That I'm serious. That the West Coast expansion is about building something sustainable, not just grabbing more territory." Marco's eyes held hers. "You gave him that. Without lying, without promising anything I can't deliver. That took skill. It took truth. The numbers don't lie, Mr. DeLuca." "Marco," he corrected again. "And you're right, numbers don't lie. But people do. Which makes me curious about what you're not saying." Evelyn's heart rate spiked. "I've given you a complete audit." "You have, but you're scared." He said it matter-of-factly, without judgment. "You've been scared since you walked in here today. Since before today, actually. I noticed it last week." "I'm not scared." "Then you're hiding something." Marco moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle. "And before you tell me it's none of my business, let me be clear. If someone is threatening you because of work you've done for me, it becomes my business." The photograph. The text message. "We're watching." Evelyn's hand moved to her stomach before she could stop it. Marco's eyes followed the gesture, and she saw the moment of recognition, the slight widening of his eyes, the quick reassessment. "How far along?" he asked quietly. The question punched the air from her lungs. "I don't know what you're—" "Please don't insult my intelligence." His voice remained gentle, but firm. "I've been watching you for weeks. The loose clothing, the way you don't drink coffee anymore, the nausea you think you're hiding. How far along?" Evelyn felt tears burning behind her eyes. Exhaustion, fear, the sheer weight of maintaining a lie that had just crumbled. 5 months, she whispered. Marco nodded slowly. "And the father?" "Not in the picture. Won't be in the picture." "Your choice or his?" "Does it matter?" "It matters if someone is using it as leverage against you." Marco pulled out a chair, gesturing for her to sit. "Tell me what happened." She should refuse, should maintain professional boundaries, should walk out right now and never come back. Instead, she sat. And then, for the first time in 5 months, Evelyn Carter told someone the truth. She told him about Miami, about the conference and the hotel bar and the tax attorney who'd lied with a smile that felt genuine until morning proved otherwise. She told him about the pregnancy test and the blocked number and the decision to handle it alone because asking for help felt like admitting she'd been stupid enough to believe a stranger's promises. Marco listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in the way of men who'd learned to control every reaction. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "And the threat?" he asked finally. Evelyn pulled out her phone, navigating to the deleted messages folder. She handed it to him without comment. Marco studied the photo first, her leaving his building, unaware of surveillance, then the text message. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "When did you receive this?" "3 nights ago, in the parking garage at my office." "You didn't call the police and tell them what? That someone took my picture and sent me a vague threat? They'd file a report and do nothing." Evelyn took her phone back. "Besides, calling the police means questions I can't answer. About you. About what I found in your books." "What did you find, Evelyn?" She met his eyes. "Evidence that your father's business was built on something other than import logistics. Evidence that money moved through channels designed to obscure its origin. Evidence that some of your current partners have connections to organizations the FBI would very much like to dismantle. And yet you kept working. I needed the money. The admission felt like failure. The fee for this audit is enough to relocate, to start over somewhere nobody knows me, to disappear before anyone connects my name to a pregnancy I can't explain." Marco set down his whiskey glass with careful precision. "Castellano didn't send that message." "How do you know?" "Because Anthony's methods are more direct. If he wanted to threaten you, he'd do it to your face. This," he gestured to her phone, "this is someone who wants to control you without being identified. Someone who benefits from you recommending against my expansion." "The Morettis," Evelyn said, remembering her research. "They control the West Coast territories you're trying to enter." "They control some of them, not all." Marco stood, pacing to the windows. "Salvatore Moretti has been consolidating power in California for the last 5 years. He sees my expansion as a direct challenge to his control. If I establish legitimate operations out there, it undermines his ability to keep everything under the table. So he's trying to sabotage you before you start." "By sabotaging you." Marco turned back to face her. "If your audit recommends against expansion, my investors lose confidence. The deal falls apart. Moretti keeps his monopoly." Evelyn's hand moved to her stomach again, this time consciously. "And if I don't recommend against it? Then the threat escalates. They've already shown they're watching you. Next step is making good on the implication in that message." "They know I'm pregnant." "Yes." Marco's voice was gentle but honest. "Which makes you vulnerable. Exactly what they want." The room felt too small suddenly, the walls pressing in. Evelyn stood, needing movement. "So what do I do? I can't finish the audit the way they want without lying. I can't continue without putting myself at risk. And I can't go to the police without exposing evidence that could destroy your business and land me in federal custody as a material witness." "You could walk away," Marco said. "Right now. Tell your firm there's a conflict of interest. Recommend they assign someone else. Take your fee and disappear like you planned." "Could I?" Evelyn turned on him, frustration breaking through professional composure. "Really? You think the Morettis will just let me go? They've been watching me for weeks, Marco. They know where I work, where I live. They know I'm carrying a child. Walking away doesn't make me less of a target. It makes me a loose end." Marco was quiet for several heartbeats. Then he pulled out his phone and made a call. "James, I need a security detail. 2 people. Rotating shifts. Full coverage starting tonight." He paused, listening. "No, not for me. For someone who's being targeted because of their association with my business. Competent, discreet, and absolutely loyal." "Yes. I'll send the details." He ended the call and looked at Evelyn. "You'll have protection. Round the clock. They'll be invisible unless they need to be visible." I'm not asking what you want," Marco interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of command that reminded her exactly who she was dealing with. "You're being threatened because of work you did for me. That makes you my responsibility. The protection isn't negotiable. I can take care of myself. Can you?" He gestured to her midsection. With a target on your back and a pregnancy that's going to become impossible to hide in the next few weeks? Be realistic, Evelyn. You need help. I'm offering it. She wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the independence that had defined her entire adult life. But the truth was, he was right. She was in over her head, and pride wouldn't keep her safe. Fine, she said. Protection. But that doesn't solve the larger problem. The Morettis will escalate regardless of whether I have bodyguards. Let me handle the Morettis. How? Marco smiled, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the ruthlessness that had built his empire. By making it very clear that threatening you was a mistake, that you're not a vulnerability, you're an asset, and that anyone who touches you answers to me directly. The possessiveness in his tone should have bothered her. Instead, it felt like relief. I need to finish the audit, she said. Give you the complete picture. After that, I'll make my recommendation based on facts, not threats. And if your recommendation supports the expansion, then you move forward, and I disappear before the fallout begins. Marco studied her for a long moment. You're really planning to vanish? Start over with a newborn and no support system? I've been planning it for months. I have money saved, connections in other cities, skills that translate anywhere. Evelyn lifted her chin. I don't need anyone's protection long-term, Marco. Just long enough to get clear of this situation. And the baby's father? You're sure he won't? He doesn't know, won't know. That's not changing. Marco nodded slowly. All right, then here's what happens next. You finish the audit with complete access to everything, all the files, all the accounts, every detail you need. I'll have my lawyers available to answer questions. You document exactly what you find, good and bad. Then you make your professional recommendation based solely on the numbers. And the security detail? Starts tonight. They'll coordinate with you directly. If anyone approaches you, if you notice any surveillance, if anything feels wrong, you contact them immediately. They'll handle it. Handle it how? However necessary. Marco's expression left no room for doubt about what that meant. The Morettis need to understand that you're under my protection. That message needs to be unambiguous. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. Not fear exactly, but recognition of the world she'd stumbled into. A world where protection and possession blurred together, where safety came with strings attached, where every choice had consequences that rippled outward in ways she couldn't control. Okay, she said quietly, we do this your way. But Marco, when this is done, when the audit is finished and the recommendation is made, I'm gone. That part isn't negotiable. Understood. He extended his hand. Thank you for trusting me with this. She took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip. I'm trusting you to keep me alive long enough to finish the job. That's not the same as trust. Fair enough. Marco released her hand but held her gaze. But Evelyn, despite what you might think, I don't make promises I can't keep. You'll be safe. Both of you. The way he said it, including the baby and his protection, made something twist in her chest, but she just nodded and gathered her materials. I'll have the completed audit to you by Wednesday, she said, along with my recommendation. I'll be waiting. She left his office feeling the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone, of alliances that complicated more than they solved, of protection that came with a price she was only beginning to understand. The security detail introduced themselves in the lobby. Two people, just as Marco had promised. A woman named Sarah Chen, who looked like she could be a yoga instructor but moved with the precision of someone with military training, and a man named David Torres, whose eyes constantly scanned their surroundings with professional paranoia. Ms. Carter, Sarah said, her voice warm but efficient, will be coordinating your security starting immediately. David will take the first shift tonight. I'll relieve him at 6 a.m. We'll stay out of your way as much as possible, but we need you to follow some basic protocols. They outlined the rules during the elevator ride down. Always notify them of travel plans, avoid establishing predictable patterns, trust their judgment if they said to move quickly. Standard protection procedures delivered with the casual competence of people who'd done this hundreds of times. Evelyn agreed to everything, too tired to argue, too scared to refuse. That night, she worked from home with David stationed in an unmarked car across the street from her apartment building. She could see him through her window when she looked, a shadow with a phone and presumably a weapon, watching for threats she couldn't identify. The audit consumed her. She worked through midnight, then past it, documenting every transaction, every irregularity, every connection that painted a picture of Marco De Luca's empire. The numbers told a story of transformation, a business built on questionable foundations trying to construct something legitimate on top. Revenue from traditional imports was growing, suspicious transactions were declining. The trajectory was clear, even if the destination wasn't guaranteed. By Wednesday morning, she had 200 pages of documentation and a recommendation that would either launch Marco's expansion or doom it. She scheduled the meeting for 10 a.m., arrived at 9:45, and found Marco waiting in the same conference room where Anthony Castellano had tested her loyalty. "You look exhausted," Marco said by way of greeting. "I haven't slept more than 4 hours a night since Friday." Evelyn set down her materials with hands that trembled slightly from caffeine and stress. "But I have your audit." And you're not going to like all of it." She opened her laptop, pulling up the summary document. "Your father's business was approximately 60% legitimate, 40% criminal enterprise. Money laundering, primarily, moving cash from various sources through shell companies and offshore accounts, then bringing it back as clean revenue from import operations." Marco's expression didn't change. "I'm aware of my father's methods. What you may not be aware of is how much of that infrastructure still exists. The shell companies are still active. The offshore accounts still receive deposits. You've reduced the volume significantly, but you haven't eliminated the channels. Because eliminating them overnight would signal exactly what I'm trying to hide." Marco leaned forward. "Legitimate businesses don't suddenly close accounts and dissolve subsidiaries without explanation. I've been winding down the illegal operations gradually, replacing dirty money with clean revenue." "I understand the strategy," Evelyn said, "but your West Coast investors are going to conduct their own due diligence. If they find these connections, they'll walk. Worse, they might report what they found to federal authorities. Which is why I hired you, to tell me how to clean this up properly." Evelyn navigated to the next section of her report. "You need to make a choice, Marco. Either you continue the gradual wind down and delay the West Coast expansion by at least 2 years while you establish a completely clean financial history, or you make a dramatic break. Dissolve the shell companies, close the offshore accounts, take the financial hit from lost revenue, and rebuild from a legitimate foundation. A dramatic break means showing weakness. Moretti will interpret it as retreat. And a gradual transition means vulnerability during the expansion. Your investors will find irregularities. Federal investigators are already sniffing around. I've received 3 calls from the FBI in the last week." Marco's eyes sharpened. "What did you tell them?" "Nothing. I haven't returned their calls, but that won't work forever." Evelyn pulled up the final section of her analysis. "Here's my professional recommendation. Make the break. Take the financial hit. Use the expansion as your public reason for restructuring. Tell everyone you're consolidating operations, streamlining management, focusing on core competencies. Dissolve every entity that has even a hint of impropriety. Start fresh." "And the revenue loss?" "Approximately 30% in the first year, but your legitimate operations are strong enough to sustain it. You'll survive the transition. More importantly, you'll survive federal scrutiny." Marco was silent for a long time, studying the numbers she'd laid out. This wasn't the recommendation the Morettis wanted. No, they wanted me to tell you the expansion was financially impossible, that you'd overextended and needed to consolidate rather than grow. Evelyn met his eyes. "But the numbers don't support that conclusion. Your business is strong, your strategy is sound. You just need to clean house first. And if I follow your recommendation, I'm essentially declaring war on everyone who profits from the current arrangement, including people inside my own organization who've been skimming from those offshore accounts." "Yes." Evelyn didn't soften it. "Which is why this is dangerous. Not just for you, but for anyone associated with your business. Including me. The security detail won't matter if you have a civil war inside your organization." She closed her laptop. "I've given you the analysis you paid for. What you do with it is your decision. But Marco, you need to understand, if you make this break, if you cut ties with the criminal infrastructure, there will be consequences. People will see it as weakness. Others will see it as opportunity. The next few months will determine whether you become legitimate or whether you get buried trying." Marco stood, moving to the windows that overlooked the city he was trying to control. My father built this business by being ruthless, by taking what he wanted and destroying anyone who got in his way. He would have called your recommendation suicide. Your father died at 56 from a stress-induced heart attack while under investigation by 3 separate federal agencies, Evelyn said quietly. Is that the legacy you want? He turned back to face her. What I want is to build something that lasts. Something my children... He paused, then continued. Something the next generation can inherit without having to look over their shoulders constantly. My father's methods worked for his era. But times change. The old model isn't sustainable. Then you know what you have to do. Marco returned to the table, picking up the printed summary of her recommendations. When you disappear after this is done, where will you go? The question caught her off guard. Does it matter? Humor me. Somewhere small. Somewhere nobody asks too many questions. Maybe Oregon. Maybe Montana. Somewhere I can work remotely and raise a child without explaining where the father is. That sounds lonely. Lonely is safe. Evelyn gathered her materials, preparing to leave. I learned that lesson the hard way. Did you? Marco set down the report. Because from where I'm standing, hiding and disappearing aren't the same as being safe. The Morettis found you. Federal investigators found you. If I wanted to find you after you vanish, I could. So could anyone else with resources and motivation. The word sent ice through her veins. Are you threatening me? I'm being realistic. You can run, Evelyn. You can change your name and move to the middle of nowhere and hope nobody cares enough to track you down. But you're a loose end now. You know too much about too many people. That doesn't go away just because you leave Chicago. Then what do you suggest? She heard the edge of panic in her voice. I can't stay here. I can't keep working in forensic accounting where every client might have connections to organizations that want to silence me. I can't... Her voice broke. I can't raise a child in the middle of your war. Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that changed everything. What if you didn't have to run? What if there was another option? What option? Work for me, directly. Not as an outside auditor, but as part of my organization. Help me clean up the financial infrastructure. Legitimize the business from the inside. In exchange, you get full protection, a salary that's triple what you're making now, and a position that comes with enough power that threatening you means threatening me. Evelyn stared at him. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You're brilliant, Evelyn. You see patterns and connections that other people miss. You understand both legitimate finance and the criminal side well enough to bridge them. I need someone with your skills to help me make this transition. Someone I can trust to be honest about what needs to change. You barely know me. I know you hid a pregnancy for 5 months while conducting a forensic audit that could have destroyed my business. I know you refused to be intimidated by the Morettis or compromised by the FBI. I know you're smart enough to survive in a world that chews people up and spits them out. Marco's intensity was palpable. That's enough. And when the baby comes, when I'm dealing with sleepless nights and diapers and everything else I have no idea how to handle, then you figure it out with support, with resources, with security that actually keeps you safe instead of hoping distance is enough. He paused. I'm not asking you to marry me, Evelyn. I'm offering you a job, one that solves your immediate problems and gives you leverage instead of forcing you to hide. She wanted to refuse, wanted to maintain the independence that had defined her for 32 years. But the truth was undeniable. He was right. Running wasn't safety. It was just fear with a different address. I need to think about it, she said finally. Take the time you need. But Evelyn, the offer expires once you walk out that door and disappear. If you run, I can't protect you. I won't chase you. You'll be on your own, and we both know how that ends. She left without answering, her mind spinning with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider. Sarah picked up the security detail outside the building, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the parking garage. Everything okay? Sarah asked, her tone professional but genuinely concerned. I don't know, Evelyn admitted. I honestly don't know. That night, lying in bed with her hand on her growing belly, Evelyn made a list of pros and cons the way she'd been trained to analyze every major decision. Running meant freedom, but also isolation. Meant safety through obscurity, but vulnerability if anyone cared enough to look. meant raising a child alone with no support system and constant fear of being found. Staying meant entanglement in Marco's world, meant accepting protection that came with obligations, meant deliberately choosing association with a man whose business straddled the line between legitimate and criminal, whose enemies became her enemies, whose future was uncertain at best. But staying also meant resources, meant not facing motherhood completely alone, meant having leverage instead of hoping invisibility was enough. At 2 a.m., with the baby doing somersaults that made sleep impossible anyway, Evelyn made her decision. She picked up her phone and sent a text to the number Marco had given her. "I'm in, but we do this on my terms. I want everything in writing: salary, benefits, protection protocols, and an exit clause if this goes sideways. I want autonomy over the financial restructuring, and I want your word that my child stays completely separate from your business." Non-negotiable. The response came within 30 seconds. "Agreed. My lawyer will have contracts ready by tomorrow. Welcome to the team, Evelyn." She set down her phone and stared at the ceiling, wondering if she'd just made the smartest decision of her life or the biggest mistake. 3 days later, federal agents arrived at her apartment at 6 a.m. with questions about DeLuca Import Solutions and an invitation to become a confidential informant that sounded more like a demand. And that's when Evelyn realized that choosing sides hadn't ended her problems. It had only changed which battles she'd have to fight. The agents showed her their badges through the peephole: FBI, White Collar Crime Division, just like the voicemail she'd ignored weeks ago. Evelyn opened the door wearing pajamas and the reality of 7 months pregnant, too tired to care about appearances and too smart to refuse federal agents entry to her home. "Ms. Carter, I'm Special Agent Rodriguez. This is Special Agent Kim." The woman was mid-40s, professional suit, eyes that had seen every evasion and lie a person could offer. "We need to talk about your work with DeLuca Import Solutions." "At 6 in the morning?" Evelyn didn't move from the doorway. "Do you have a warrant?" "We're not here to search your residence. We're here to have a conversation." Rodriguez's tone was perfectly calibrated, not threatening, not friendly, just inevitable. "But if you'd prefer to have it at our field office, we can arrange that." Evelyn stepped aside, letting them enter her small apartment that suddenly felt even smaller with 2 federal agents filling the living room. She'd been up since 4 anyway, the baby making sleep impossible with what felt like gymnastics practice against her ribs. "Would you like coffee?" she asked, because her mother had raised her to be polite even to people who might destroy her life. "We're fine, thank you." Agent Kim settled onto her couch without invitation, pulling out a tablet. "Ms. Carter, you've been conducting a forensic audit of DeLuca Import Solutions for approximately 8 weeks. Is that correct?" "It was 8 weeks. The audit is complete." Evelyn remained standing, one hand unconsciously protecting her belly. "I submitted my final report 3 days ago. And your recommendation?" "Is confidential client information. I'm sure you understand." Rodriguez smiled without warmth. "We understand that Marco DeLuca is attempting to expand his operations into West Coast territories currently controlled by rival organizations. We understand that he hired one of the best forensic accountants in Chicago to legitimize his books. And we understand that you're now employed directly by DeLuca Industries as their chief financial officer." The title was new. Marco's lawyers had delivered the contracts yesterday, complete with salary figures that made Evelyn's previous income look like poverty wages. She'd signed them after reading every word twice, knowing exactly what she was agreeing to. "Is there a question in there?" Evelyn asked. "The question is whether you understand what you've gotten yourself involved in." Kim leaned forward. "Marco DeLuca's business is built on his father's criminal empire. Money laundering, extortion, trafficking. Vincent DeLuca had his hands in everything. The son is smoother, more sophisticated, but the foundation is rotten. Then arrest him. If you have evidence of criminal activity, charge him." Evelyn met Kim's eyes steadily. "But you haven't, which means you don't have a case. You need someone inside his organization to build one." "We need someone who cares more about the law than about a paycheck," Rodriguez said. "Someone who understands that legitimizing a criminal enterprise doesn't erase the crimes it was built on. I'm an accountant, not a law enforcement officer. My job is to ensure financial compliance with current regulations, not to investigate historical activities." Kim's expression hardened. "Your job is also not to obstruct a federal investigation. And that's exactly what you're doing by helping DeLuca clean up his books. I'm helping a business transition to legitimate operations. If that interferes with your investigation, perhaps your investigation should focus on actual current crimes instead of hoping you can build a case from old sins. Evelyn felt anger rising, hot and sharp. Unless you have specific questions about specific illegal activities I've witnessed, I think we're done here. Rodriguez stood, moving closer. Ms. Carter, let me be very clear about something. Marco DeLuca is dangerous. The people he associates with are dangerous. The world you've just entered doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't protect people who become inconvenient. You're 7 months pregnant, and you've made yourself a target for every rival organization that wants to hurt DeLuca. Is that really the situation you want to bring a child into? The words hit like a physical blow because they echoed every fear Evelyn had been trying to suppress, but she kept her voice steady. The situation I'm bringing a child into is one where I have resources, security, and the ability to provide a stable life. That's more than I had 3 weeks ago when I was planning to disappear and hope nobody cared enough to find me. She moved to the door, opening it. If you want to help me, Agent Rodriguez, then do your job and arrest the people who are actually committing crimes. Don't ask me to risk my life and my child's safety to build your case. Kim handed her a business card. When you change your mind, and you will, call that number. The offer to cooperate won't stay open forever. They left, and Evelyn locked the door behind them with shaking hands. Then she called Marco. He answered on the first ring. The FBI. How did you know? Because they visited me an hour ago with the same recruitment pitch. They're running out of time on whatever investigation they're building, so they're getting desperate. His voice was calm, reassuring. Are you okay? They know I'm working for you. They know about the expansion. They know... She stopped, not wanting to say it out loud. They know you're pregnant. I assumed they would. Federal investigators are thorough. Marco paused. Evelyn, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not speak to them again without a lawyer present. Do not answer questions. Do not try to explain or justify anything. They'll twist every word into evidence. They said I was obstructing their investigation. You're not. You're exercising your right to privacy and attorney-client privilege. There's a difference. She heard movement on his end, voices in the background. I'm sending Thomas Keller to your apartment. He's the best defense attorney in the city. If the FBI contacts you again, you refer them to him immediately. Marco, maybe they're right. Maybe I've made a mistake. You haven't made a mistake. You've made a choice. There's a difference. His voice gentled. I know this is overwhelming. I know you're scared. But you're not alone in this anymore, Evelyn. I meant what I said about protection. After the call ended, she stood in her kitchen and tried to remember how to breathe. The baby kicked hard, as if reminding her that she wasn't the only one whose future depended on the decisions she made today. Thomas Keller arrived 90 minutes later, impeccably dressed and carrying a leather briefcase that probably cost more than her monthly rent used to be. He was older than she expected, late 50s, gray hair, the kind of face that inspired confidence in courtrooms and fear in prosecutors. Ms. Carter. He shook her hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. Marco has briefed me on your situation. May I sit? They settled at her small dining table, and Keller pulled out a legal pad with notes already written in precise handwriting. The FBI has been investigating the DeLuca organization for approximately 18 months, he began without preamble. They have evidence of historical criminal activity under Vincent DeLuca's leadership, but very little that directly implicates Marco in ongoing illegal operations. They need someone inside the organization to testify about current activities. You're their latest recruitment target. They threatened me, said I was obstructing their investigation. An empty threat designed to frighten you into cooperation. You've committed no crime. You're under no legal obligation to assist their investigation. Keller made a note on his pad. However, I need you to be completely honest with me about what you found during your audit. If there's evidence of current illegal activity in DeLuca's books, we need to know before the FBI finds it. Evelyn had been expecting this question. She pulled out her laptop, navigating to encrypted files she'd kept separate from her official report. There are irregularities, offshore accounts that receive deposits from shell companies, transactions that are structured to avoid reporting requirements, payment patterns that suggest money laundering. She turned the screen so Keller could see. But here's what the FBI won't find. All of this activity has been declining over the past 2 years. Marco's been systematically shutting down the criminal infrastructure. The offshore accounts are being closed, the shell companies are being dissolved, the suspicious transactions are being replaced with legitimate revenue. Keller studied the data with the focus of someone who'd built a career on details. This shows intent to reform. That's valuable. It also shows knowledge of criminal activity, Evelyn countered, which makes Marco complicit, even if he's trying to fix it. Complicit is a strong word. He inherited a business with questionable practices and has been working to legitimize it. That's not the same as actively participating in criminal enterprise. Keller looked up from the screen. Can you testify to witnessing any actual crimes? Drug trafficking, extortion, violence? No. Everything I found was financial. Historical patterns that suggest illegal activity, but no direct evidence of specific crimes. Then the FBI's case is weak. They can prove Vincent DeLuca ran a criminal organization. They can prove Marco inherited that organization. But they can't prove he's continuing his father's activities unless someone inside testifies to witnessing current crimes. Keller closed the laptop. Which is why they're pressuring you. You're their best chance at a cooperative witness. What happens if I refuse to cooperate? They continue investigating until they find something actionable or until they give up. Based on the desperation of their approach this morning, I'd estimate they're closer to giving up than finding evidence. Keller's expression was serious. But Ms. Carter, you need to understand something. Refusing to cooperate with the FBI doesn't make you safe. It makes you a problem they'd like to solve. They might subpoena you to testify before a grand jury. They might pressure the IRS to audit your personal finances. They might make your life very difficult in hopes you'll change your mind. So I'm trapped. Either I cooperate and become a target for everyone in Marco's world, or I refuse and become a target for federal investigators. Or you do your job with absolute precision and give them nothing to work with. Keller handed her his card. Document everything. Keep meticulous records. Ensure that every financial decision you make for DeLuca Industries is completely defensible and entirely legal. If they can't prove criminal activity, they can't prosecute. And if they can't prosecute, eventually they'll move on to easier targets. He left her with instructions to contact him immediately if the FBI approached her again, and with the uncomfortable awareness that her life had become a careful dance between competing dangers. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of restructuring, late-night meetings, and the constant presence of security details that rotated between Sarah and David with military precision. Evelyn moved into the DeLuca building, occupying an office on the 22nd floor with views of the city and enough space for the specialized equipment she needed to untangle years of questionable accounting. Marco gave her complete access to everything, every account, every subsidiary, every transaction that had moved through his organization for the last decade. It was a gesture of trust that she hadn't asked for and wasn't entirely sure she deserved. "You're giving me enough information to destroy you," she said during one of their daily briefings. "Don't you worry, I'll use it. If you wanted to destroy me, you would have cooperated with the FBI." Marco signed off on another dissolution order, closing a shell company that had been funneling money through the Caymans since his father's era. Besides, destroying me destroys your position. Your safety depends on my organization remaining strong enough to protect you. That's a cynical way to build trust. It's a realistic way to acknowledge that our interests align. He looked up from the paperwork. "How are you feeling? Physically, I mean." The question caught her off guard. Marco rarely asked about the pregnancy directly, though she noticed small considerations. A ergonomic chair that appeared in her office, scheduled breaks built into meeting agendas, instructions to security that she was not to lift anything heavy. Tired, uncomfortable, ready for this to be over. She pressed a hand to her lower back, trying to ease the constant ache that had become her companion. "The doctor says everything is progressing normally. Another 8 weeks, give or take. Have you thought about what happens after? Maternity leave, childcare, that kind of thing?" "I'm trying not to think that far ahead. One crisis at a time." Marco was quiet for a moment. "My mother had help when my sister and I were born. A nanny who lived in the house, family members who rotated through, that whole Italian grandmother thing where nobody raises a child alone. It's not the same for everyone, I know, but..." He stopped, seeming uncertain for the first time since she'd met him. What I'm trying to say is that you don't have to figure it out by yourself. The organization has resources. We can arrange whatever support you need. Evelyn felt something twist in her chest. Gratitude mixed with fear of dependency, appreciation mixed with awareness that accepting help meant accepting obligation. That's generous, she said carefully. But Marco, I need to be clear about something. This job, this arrangement, it's professional. You're not responsible for my personal situation. I know that, but the pregnancy is part of your reality, which means it affects your ability to do your job. Making sure you have support isn't generosity, it's good business. He smiled slightly. Besides, you're about to save this organization millions of dollars in legal fees and federal fines. The least I can do is make sure you're not trying to do it while dealing with sleepless nights and diaper changes alone. Before she could respond, his phone buzzed. Marco glanced at the screen and his expression darkened. Problem? Evelyn asked. The Morettis are making moves. Salvatore arrived in Chicago this morning with enough people to start a war. Marco stood, already moving toward the door. I need to handle this. Can you finish the Cayman account closures without me? Yes, but Marco, if there's going to be violence, there won't be. Salvatore is smart enough to know that open conflict brings federal attention neither of us wants. This will be a conversation. He paused at the door. Stay in the building. Security is doubled as of now. If anything feels wrong, you go to the safe room on the 24th floor and you wait for my call. He left before she could argue, and Evelyn was left alone with spreadsheets and the uncomfortable awareness that Marco's world operated on rules she was still learning to navigate. The safe room turned out to be unnecessary, but the meeting with Salvatore Moretti changed everything anyway. Marco returned 4 hours later with Anthony Castellano and 2 other men Evelyn didn't recognize. They locked themselves in the executive conference room, and even through soundproofed walls she could hear the raised voices. Sarah appeared at her office door. We should move you to secure location. Marco said to stay in the building. Oh, Marco didn't know the meeting would go this badly. Sarah's hand was on her weapon, not drawn but ready. Please, Ms. Carter, let's not take chances. Evelyn saved her work and followed Sarah to the 24th floor, where the safe room turned out to be a fully equipped apartment with reinforced walls, independent power, and enough supplies to sustain several people for days if necessary. David was already there, monitoring security feeds on multiple screens. What's happening? Evelyn asked. Moretti came here to negotiate territory. Marco offered to split the West Coast. Moretti keeps California. Marco takes Oregon and Washington. Moretti rejected it. He wants Marco to abandon the expansion entirely. David gestured to one of the screens. That's not going to happen. So what will happen? Either they reach a compromise, or Moretti declares this a hostile move and we're looking at real conflict. Sarah's tone was matter-of-fact. Either way, you're staying here until it's resolved. Evelyn spent the next 2 hours watching security feeds and trying not to panic about the fact that she'd tied her future and her child's safety to a man who was currently negotiating with people who solved problems with violence. When Marco finally appeared in the doorway of the safe room, he looked exhausted. It's handled, he said. You can go back to your office. What kind of handled? Evelyn asked. The kind where everyone leaves unhappy but alive. Moretti agreed to let me move forward with the Oregon and Washington expansion. I agreed to stay out of California for the next 3 years and to share shipping routes through the Panama Canal. Anthony mediated, which means I owe him favors I'll be paying off for years. Marco ran a hand through his hair. But it's done. No war. No escalation. Just compromises that weaken your position. Compromises that keep everyone breathing. Marco's eyes met hers, including you. Moretti wanted to know about my new CFO. I told him you were off limits, that touching you meant declaring war on me personally. He agreed, but Evelyn, that protection only holds if my organization stays strong. If I show weakness, if the expansion fails, Moretti will reconsider every agreement we just made. The pressure of that reality settled onto her shoulders like physical weight. Her work wasn't just about financial restructuring anymore. It was about survival, hers, Marco's, everyone who depended on the stability of an organization balanced on the knife's edge between legitimate business and criminal empire. Then we don't show weakness, she said. We finish the restructuring, we execute the expansion perfectly, and we prove that going legitimate makes you stronger, not weaker. Marco smiled, genuine warmth breaking through exhaustion. We. I like that you're thinking in terms of we. Don't read too much into it. I'm professionally invested in your success. That's all this is. Of course, professional investment. But his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe her, and truthfully, Evelyn wasn't sure she believed it herself anymore. That night, alone in her apartment with security stationed outside and the baby doing acrobatics against her ribs, Evelyn let herself acknowledge the truth she'd been avoiding. She wasn't just professionally invested in Marco DeLuca's success. She was emotionally tangled in a situation that had started as a job and become something far more complicated. She admired his intelligence, his determination to transform his father's legacy into something better. She appreciated his protectiveness, even as it made her uncomfortable. She was starting to trust him in ways that terrified her, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about any of it. The baby kicked hard, as if offering an opinion. Evelyn pressed her hand to the movement, feeling the reality of a life that depended entirely on her making the right choices. "I know," she whispered to her daughter, because somehow she'd started thinking of the baby as she had started imagining a little girl with her determination and her father's eyes that she'd never see. "I know this is complicated, but we're going to be okay. I promise." It was a promise she desperately wanted to keep, even as she felt control slipping through her fingers with every passing day. She'd thought joining Marco's organization would give her leverage, would make her safer. Instead, it had made her essential, which meant she couldn't walk away even if she wanted to. She was bound to his success and his survival in ways that went far beyond any employment contract. The FBI called again 2 days later. This time, Evelyn was prepared. "Special Agent Rodriguez, any questions you have for me should go through my attorney, Thomas Keller." She recited his number from memory. "I have nothing further to discuss with you." "Ms. Carter, we know Marco DeLuca is meeting with Salvatore Moretti. We know there's conflict between the organizations. This is your last chance to cooperate before this situation becomes violent. Then do your job and prevent the violence instead of trying to recruit informants." She felt trapped in a situation that was spiraling beyond her control, bound to a man whose world was built on foundations that could collapse at any moment, and responsible for a child who deserved better than to be born into the middle of a war between criminals, federal investigators, and a woman who'd thought she could handle it all alone. The truth was, she couldn't handle it alone. She needed Marco's protection. She needed his organization's resources. She needed the stability he offered, even as she feared the cost of accepting it. And that dependence, that need, was the most terrifying thing of all. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning when Evelyn was 31 weeks pregnant and convinced she had at least another month before her carefully constructed world would have to make room for the reality of motherhood. She was wrong on both counts. She'd been at her desk since 7, reviewing contracts for the Oregon facility acquisition that represented the first major step in Marco's West Coast expansion. The numbers were clean, the legal structure was sound, and for the first time in months, she felt like maybe they were actually going to pull this off. The transition from criminal empire to legitimate business was happening, slowly but measurably. Shell companies were dissolved, offshore accounts were closed, revenue streams were increasingly defensible under federal scrutiny. The pain started as a dull ache in her lower back, the kind she'd been experiencing for weeks. She ignored it, focusing instead on the revenue projections that would determine whether their investors stayed committed or got nervous and pulled out. Then the ache sharpened into something that stole her breath. Evelyn pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the hardness there that her doctor had warned her about. Braxton Hicks contractions, probably. Practice labor. Nothing to worry about unless they became regular or intensified, except they were intensifying. She checked the time, 9:47 a.m. Checked again when the next contraction hit. 9:53 a.m., 6 minutes apart. That wasn't Braxton Hicks. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, trying to decide who to call. Her doctor was the logical choice, but the pain was getting worse, and she wasn't sure she could drive herself to the hospital. Sarah was downstairs, part of the security rotation, but admitting she needed help meant admitting she was in labor, which meant everything was about to change in ways she wasn't prepared for. The decision was made for her when the next contraction hit hard enough that she gasped, and Marco appeared in her office doorway. "Evelyn?" He was across the room in 3 strides, his hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong?" "I think—" Another wave of pain cut off her words. "I think I'm in labor." Marco's expression shifted from concern to focused action in an instant. "How far apart are the contractions?" 5 minutes. Maybe less. Evelyn tried to stand and felt fluid rush down her legs. She looked down at the puddle forming on the expensive carpet and felt panic claw its way up her throat. "My water just broke. Marco, it's too early. I'm only 31 weeks. It's going to be okay." Wayne. His voice was steady, calm, the same tone he used when negotiating with rivals and diffusing conflicts. "We're going to get you to the hospital. Sarah!" He was already pulling out his phone, already moving. "I need the car brought around immediately. Northwestern Memorial, fastest route, and call ahead. We have a patient in premature labor." Sarah appeared, took one look at Evelyn, and was on her radio coordinating with the security team before Marco finished his sentence. "Can you walk?" Marco asked Evelyn. "I don't know. I think so." She took a step and felt another contraction building. "Wait." Marco caught her as her knees buckled, lifting her with an ease that suggested he'd done this before, though she knew he hadn't. "I've got you. Sarah, clear the elevator." The trip to the hospital passed in a blur of pain in Marco's voice, steady, reassuring, lying about how everything would be fine when they both knew 31 weeks was too early, that premature babies faced complications, that nothing about this situation was fine. At the hospital, things moved fast. Wheelchair, triage, examination room, monitors strapped to her belly. Tracking contractions that were coming faster now, 3 minutes apart, 2 minutes. The baby's heartbeat rapid and stressed. "Ms. Carter, I'm Dr. Patel." The obstetrician was young, competent, moving with the efficiency of someone who delivered hundreds of babies. "Your water has broken, and you're having regular contractions. We're going to try to slow the labor, give the baby more time to develop, but if we can't stop it, we'll need to prepare for an early delivery." "How early?" Evelyn managed between contractions. 31 weeks is viable, but not ideal. The baby's lungs aren't fully developed. We'll administer steroids to help with that, but there's a risk of respiratory distress, feeding difficulties, potential long-term complications. Dr. Patel's honesty was clinical, professional, terrifying. "We're going to do everything we can to give your daughter the best possible outcome." Daughter. Evelyn had known somehow, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way it hadn't been before. She was having a daughter, weeks too early, in the middle of chaos she'd created by thinking she could manage everything alone. "I need to make a call," she said. "I need to tell—" She stopped because there was nobody to tell. No family she was in contact with, no friends she'd kept close, nobody except the man sitting beside her hospital bed who had no obligation to be there but showed no sign of leaving. Marco seemed to read her thoughts. "Your sister, Rachel, right? You mentioned her once. Should I try to contact her?" Evelyn felt tears burn behind her eyes. She'd cut Rachel out of her life 2 years ago after an argument about choices and responsibility, about Evelyn's tendency to isolate when things got hard. They hadn't spoken since. "She lives in Denver, but Marco, we haven't talked in years. She doesn't even know I'm pregnant." "Maybe it's time she did." He pulled out his phone. "What's her number?" Evelyn recited it from memory, even though she'd deleted the contact long ago. "Some things stayed with you even when you tried to forget them." Marco stepped into the hallway to make the call while Dr. Patel administered medication to try to slow the contractions. It didn't work. 20 minutes later, the contractions were stronger, closer together, and the baby's heart rate was showing signs of distress. "We need to deliver," Dr. Patel said. "Your daughter isn't tolerating the labor well. C-section is safest at this point." Everything after that happened with frightening speed. Consent forms she signed without reading, an IV line placed in her arm, the anesthesiologist explaining the epidural, while another contraction hit hard enough to make her cry out. Marco reappearing, now wearing surgical scrubs someone had given him, his hand finding hers. "Rachel is on the next flight out," he said quietly. "She'll be here in 4 hours." "You told her everything?" "I told her you needed her. That was enough." His grip tightened. Evelyn, they're going to take you into surgery now. I can come with you if you want, or I can wait outside. Your choice. She should tell him to wait outside, should maintain boundaries that were already far too blurred, should remember that he was her employer, not her partner, not the baby's father, not anything except someone who'd offered protection in exchange for professional services. Please stay, she heard herself say. I don't want to be alone. Marco's expression softened. You're not alone. Not anymore. The operating room was blindingly bright, full of people in masks and gloves, machines beeping and whirring. They positioned her on the table, extended her arms, draped her body with sterile sheets that created a barrier between her and what was happening below. Marco sat beside her head, his hand still holding hers, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. Talk to me, Evelyn said, needing distraction from the pressure and pulling she could feel but not see. About anything. Just talk. When my sister was born, I was 7 years old, Marco said, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. My mother was in labor for 16 hours. My father paced the waiting room the entire time, driving everyone crazy with his nervous energy. When they finally let him see my mother and my sister, he cried. Only time I ever saw him cry. He said it was because he'd been given a miracle he didn't deserve. What was her name? Your sister? Isabella. Bella. Something shifted in his voice. She died when she was 19. Car accident. Drunk driver ran a red light. Evelyn turned her head to look at him, seeing grief etched in the lines around his eyes. Marco, I'm sorry. I didn't know. Not many people do. It was a long time ago, but... He stopped as one of the doctors called out something medical, machines beeping faster. It changes you. Losing someone like that makes you understand how fragile everything is. You're feeling pressure, Dr. Patel's voice cut through the moment. That's normal. Almost there, Miss Carter. Then there was a sensation Evelyn couldn't describe. Release, emptiness, the sudden absence of weight she'd been carrying for 7 months. And silence. Terrible silence where there should have been crying. Why isn't she crying? Evelyn tried to sit up, panic overwhelming everything else. Marco, why isn't she... The NICU team has her, Dr. Patel said calmly. She needs help breathing. That's expected with premature delivery. Evelyn caught a glimpse of tiny limbs, impossibly small, being passed to a team of specialists who surrounded an incubator with the intensity of people fighting to save a life. Her daughter. So small. Too small. Is she alive? The question came out broken, terrified. She's alive, one of the neonatal doctors confirmed, but her lungs are underdeveloped. We're intubating now to help her breathe. Miss Carter, your daughter is a fighter. She's got a strong heartbeat. We're going to take her to the NICU and get her stabilized. They wheeled the incubator past where Evelyn could see it, a tiny body, barely 5 pounds, hooked up to more wires and tubes than seemed possible. Her daughter, real and alive and desperately fragile. Then they were gone, taking her baby to a sterile room where Evelyn couldn't follow, where machines would breathe for her and monitors would track every heartbeat, where her daughter would fight for survival without her mother present. Marco's hand was still holding hers, and Evelyn realized she was crying, silent tears streaming down her face while Dr. Patel finished the surgery and someone cleaned blood from places Evelyn couldn't see. She's going to be okay, Marco said quietly. She's got your stubbornness. That counts for something. Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that determination was enough to overcome biology and circumstance. But she'd spent her entire career analyzing risk and probability, and she knew the statistics on babies born this early, knew the complications they faced, knew that sometimes wanting something desperately wasn't enough to make it true. Recovery was a blur of pain medication and exhaustion, and nurses checking vital signs while Evelyn asked the same questions over and over. When could she see her daughter? How was she doing? Was she breathing on her own yet? The answers were always the same. Soon. She's stable. Not yet. Marco stayed, through the hours after surgery when Evelyn drifted in and out of consciousness. Through the evening when a NICU nurse finally came to explain that her daughter, 3 pounds, 12 ounces, 14 inches long, was on a ventilator but holding her own. Through the night when Evelyn woke crying from dreams where she'd lost everything that mattered. You should go home, Evelyn said when dawn light started filtering through the hospital windows. You have a business to run. The Oregon deal needs to close this week. The business can wait. You can't. Marco looked exhausted, rumpled, completely unlike the polished executive who commanded boardrooms and negotiated with criminals. Besides, Rachel will be here soon. Someone should update her before she arrives. Rachel appeared at 11 a.m., her face a mixture of concern and confusion and anger that 2 years of silence had earned. She was younger than Evelyn by 3 years, with the same sharp features but softer edges, the same intelligence channeled into social work instead of numbers. Eve. Rachel stopped in the doorway, taking in her sister in a hospital bed, the man sitting beside her, the evidence of everything Evelyn hadn't shared. What the hell is going on? That's a longer story than I can tell right now. Evelyn's voice was rough from crying and medication. But I had a baby, a daughter. She's in the NICU. She's early and there are complications, but she's alive. Rachel's expression cycled through shock, hurt, and finally determination. She crossed to the bed and pulled Evelyn into a fierce hug that made her surgical incision scream in protest. You should have called me, Rachel said against her hair. Months ago, years ago. You shouldn't have gone through this alone. I wasn't alone. Evelyn pulled back, looking at Marco. This is Marco DeLuca. He's... She paused, trying to find words for what he was. He's my employer, and he's been helping me. Rachel studied Marco with the sharp assessment of someone who spent her career reading people in crisis. Helping how? By making sure your sister and her daughter are safe, Marco said simply. By being here when she needed someone to be here. And what does he get in return? Rachel's tone was protective, suspicious. A damn good CFO who's saving his business from federal prosecution, Evelyn answered before Marco could. It's professional, Rachel. He's not... This isn't... She stopped, too tired to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. Rachel looked between them, clearly skeptical but choosing not to push. Okay, where's my niece? I want to meet her. The NICU was a place of beeping machines and hushed voices and tiny bodies fighting for survival in plastic boxes. Evelyn's daughter was in an incubator near the window, surrounded by monitors displaying numbers that Evelyn had learned to interpret. Heart rate, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate, all the data that determined whether her child lived or died. You can touch her, the nurse said gently, through the incubator ports. She needs to know you're here. Evelyn reached through the opening, her hand seeming enormous next to her daughter's tiny body. She touched one impossibly small foot, feeling warmth and life and the terrible fragility of new existence. Hi, baby girl, she whispered. I'm your mom. I'm sorry I couldn't keep you safe inside longer. I'm sorry this is so hard. But you're doing so well. You're so strong. The baby's foot flexed against her palm, and Evelyn felt her heart crack open in ways she hadn't known were possible. She needs a name, Rachel said softly. You can't just keep calling her baby girl. Evelyn looked at the tiny face beneath the ventilator tube, at eyes that would open when she was ready, at a life that had entered the world fighting. Lily, she said. Her name is Lily. It meant resilience and rebirth and hope, all the things Evelyn desperately wanted for her daughter. It was a name that carried no family legacy, no father's identity, no history except what they would build together. Marco stood beside her, looking at the baby with an expression Evelyn couldn't quite read. Lily, that's perfect. Over the next 72 hours, Evelyn lived in the space between her recovery room and the NICU, watching machines breathe for her daughter and willing her to be strong enough to breathe on her own. Rachel stayed, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs and bringing coffee. Evelyn wasn't supposed to drink, and filling the silence with stories about the last 2 years they'd lost to stubbornness and pride. I'm sorry, Evelyn said during one of those long nights when Lily's oxygen levels were low and the nurses were adjusting her ventilator settings. For cutting you out, for thinking I had to handle everything alone. You always thought that, Rachel said without judgment. Ever since Mom died and you decided being vulnerable meant being weak. But Eve, this... She gestured to the NICU, to Lily fighting for every breath. This isn't something you can control with spreadsheets and planning. You need people. You need help. I know that now. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, you've built another wall around yourself. That man out there, Rachel nodded toward where Marco sat in the waiting area, making phone calls and running his business from a hospital chair. He's clearly more than just your employer, but you won't admit it. You're still trying to control everything, still trying to protect yourself from needing anyone. He's not the baby's father. He has no obligation to be here. And yet he is. Every day. Bringing you food you'll actually eat, talking to doctors, making sure you sleep, acting like someone who cares a hell of a lot more than an employer should. Rachel's eyes were knowing. What are you so afraid of, Eve? I'm afraid of depending on someone who might leave. I'm afraid of needing someone who's only here because I'm useful. I'm afraid, Evelyn's voice broke. I'm afraid of letting myself feel anything for him when I know how this story ends. He's dangerous, Rachel. His world is violent and complicated, and I can't raise Lily in the middle of it. Then why are you still here? Why didn't you run like you planned? Because running doesn't keep us safe. It just makes us alone, and safe is an illusion either way. Evelyn pressed her hands to her face. I don't know what I'm doing. I thought I had answers, but I don't. I just know that right now, in this moment, Marco is here and I need that. Even if it's temporary. Even if it complicates everything. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Maybe that's enough. Maybe you don't need to have all the answers right now. Maybe you just need to let yourself accept help from someone who's offering it without demanding it be perfect or permanent. The words settled into Evelyn like a truth she'd been avoiding. She'd spent so long trying to control every variable, plan every contingency, protect herself from every possible hurt. But you couldn't plan for premature labor, or federal investigations, or falling for a man whose business was built on his father's crimes. You couldn't control who showed up when you needed them, or who stayed when things got hard. All you could do was survive the moment in front of you and hope the next one would be easier. On Lily's 4th day of life, they tried to wean her off the ventilator. Evelyn stood beside the incubator, holding her breath while nurses adjusted settings and doctors monitored responses. If Lily could breathe on her own, it meant her lungs were developing properly. It meant she was getting stronger. The first attempt failed. Lily's oxygen levels dropped too low too fast, and they had to reinstate full ventilator support. It's normal, Dr. Patel assured her. Premature lungs take time. We'll try again tomorrow. But tomorrow brought the same result. And the next day, each failed attempt felt like evidence that Evelyn had broken something fundamental by going into labor too early, by not being able to keep her daughter safe. This isn't your fault, Marco said on the 6th day, when Evelyn was staring at monitors and trying not to cry. Biology isn't something you can control with determination. I should have been more careful. Should have noticed the warning signs earlier. Should have what? Prevented premature labor through sheer force of will? His voice was gentle but firm. Evelyn, you're a brilliant accountant. You see patterns and solve problems and make order from chaos. But you can't apply that same logic to everything. Sometimes things just happen, and the only thing you can control is how you respond. I don't know how to respond to this. I don't know how to just sit here and watch her struggle and not be able to fix it. Marco took her hand, the gesture so familiar now that she barely registered it. You respond by being here, by touching her every day so she knows she's not alone, by trusting the doctors who are doing everything possible to help her, by taking care of yourself so you can take care of her when she comes home. When, not if. When, Marco confirmed. She's got your stubbornness, remember? She's going to fight until she wins. That night, while Evelyn was sleeping in her recovery room, finally released from constant medical supervision, but refusing to leave the hospital while Lily was still in the NICU, the FBI made their move. Agents Rodriguez and Kim appeared in the hallway outside her room at 2 a.m. with federal warrants and questions that couldn't wait until morning. But Marco's lawyers were faster, appearing within 15 minutes with injunctions and threats of their own. Evelyn woke to the sound of arguing voices and found herself in the middle of a legal battle she'd been trying to avoid. Ms. Carter has just given birth to a premature infant currently in intensive care, Thomas Keller was saying with icy precision. Your timing is unconscionable, and your tactics are bordering on harassment. Unless you have evidence of an immediate crime, you will leave this hospital immediately. We have evidence that Marco DeLuca is using his CFO to restructure criminal assets, Rodriguez countered. That makes Ms. Carter an accessory to legitimate business practices that you've been investigating for 18 months without finding actionable evidence of current criminal activity, Keller interrupted. If you had a case, Agent Rodriguez, you would have made arrests instead of harassing a new mother in the middle of the night. The argument continued, but Evelyn had stopped listening. She was focused on a different sound, alarms from the NICU, urgent voices, the terrible awareness that something was wrong. She was out of bed and moving before anyone could stop her, ignoring the pull of surgical stitches and the protests of nurses who tried to redirect her back to her room. She reached the NICU to find doctors surrounding Lily's incubator, moving with the controlled urgency that meant crisis. "What's happening?" Evelyn demanded. "What's wrong with my daughter?" The neonatal specialist turned, his expression serious. "Lily's oxygen saturation dropped suddenly. We're working to stabilize her, but Ms. Carter, you need to prepare yourself." "No." The word came out sharp, absolute. "No, she's going to be fine. She's a fighter. She's very sick," the doctor said gently. "The ventilator settings are maxed out and she's still struggling. If we can't stabilize her in the next few hours, we may need to consider more aggressive interventions." Marco appeared beside her, somehow knowing she needed him without being called. His arm went around her shoulders, supporting weight she couldn't hold on her own. "What kind of interventions?" he asked, his voice steady where Evelyn's would have broken. "ECMO, extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. Essentially a heart-lung bypass machine that would give her body time to heal. It's high risk, especially for a baby this small, but if conventional support isn't enough, it may be our only option." Evelyn watched her daughter struggle for every breath behind the glass of the incubator, watched monitors display numbers that were all wrong, watched her world narrow to one terrible question. Would her determination to survive alone cost her daughter everything? The decision to put Lily on ECMO came at 4:47 a.m., when her oxygen saturation refused to climb above dangerous levels despite maximum ventilator support. Evelyn signed consent forms with shaking hands while doctors explained risks she could barely process through the fog of terror, bleeding complications, stroke, infection, the very real possibility that even this aggressive intervention might not be enough. "How long will she be on the machine?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Days, possibly weeks. We'll wean her off as soon as her lungs can handle the work on their own." The ECMO specialist was matter-of-fact, professional. "Ms. Carter, this gives your daughter the best chance. Her body needs time to heal, and ECMO buys her that time." They wheeled Lily to a specialized suite where the bypass machine waited, a complex system of pumps and tubes that would do the work her tiny body couldn't manage yet. Evelyn wasn't allowed to follow, couldn't watch them cannulate her daughter's vessels and connect her to machines that would circulate her blood outside her body. Marco pulled her into the family waiting room, away from the clinical efficiency of the NICU, away from the federal agents who'd been temporarily banished by hospital security, but would return with more warrants and more questions. "She's going to survive this," Marco said, his hands on Evelyn's shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Lily is strong. She's a fighter. She just needs time." "Time I gave her too little of," Evelyn's voice broke. "If I hadn't gone into labor early, if I'd been more careful, if I hadn't been so stressed about the FBI and the Morettis and trying to manage everything on its own—" "Stop." Marco's tone was firm. "You can't blame yourself for biology. Premature labor happens. It's not your fault." "Isn't it?" The words came out harsh, accusatory. "I knew I was in over my head. I knew working for you put me in the middle of something dangerous. But I did it anyway because I was scared and I needed protection and I thought I could handle the stress. And now my daughter is paying the price for my choices." Marco was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. "You're right. This is partially my fault. I brought you into a situation that was more dangerous than either of us anticipated. I offered you protection, but I couldn't protect you from the stress of living in my world. And for that, I'm sorry." His hands dropped from her shoulders. "Which is why I've made a decision. I'm pulling out of Chicago." Evelyn stared at him. "What?" "The West Coast expansion is moving forward, but I'm moving my base of operations to Portland. New city, new start, complete separation from the Chicago territories and everyone fighting over them." Marco's expression was resolved. "Castellano can have the south side. Moretti can have his California monopoly. I'm done fighting wars my father started. I'm building something new. Marco, you can't just abandon your entire organization. I'm not abandoning it. I'm transforming it. The restructuring you've been doing proves the business can survive without the criminal infrastructure. Revenue from legitimate operations is strong enough to sustain us. We don't need the old alliances or the old methods. He pulled out his phone, showing her documents she recognized. I've already started negotiations with the FBI. Full cooperation in exchange for immunity. I give them everything on the Castellanos, the Morettis, everyone who's still operating criminal enterprises. They get their prosecutions, I get a clean slate. That's suicide. Testifying against those families makes you a target, only if I stay in Chicago where they can reach me. But if I'm in Portland with federal protection and a completely legitimate business operation, I'm just another businessman who cooperated with law enforcement. Untouchable. Marco met her eyes. This is what you wanted, isn't it? A way out that doesn't involve running and hiding. I'm giving you that option. Come to Portland with me. Bring Lily. Start over somewhere safe. Evelyn felt the offer settle into her chest like a weight and a relief simultaneously. And what happens to everyone here? Your employees? Your people who depend on you? The ones who want legitimate work come with me. The ones who don't can find new employers. I'm not responsible for people who choose criminal enterprise over legitimate business. His voice was steady, certain. Evelyn, I've been trying to do this halfway, keep one foot in my father's world while building something better. But halfway isn't working. It's making everyone vulnerable, including you and Lily. So I'm making a clean break. All in on legitimacy, all in on the future instead of the past. Before Evelyn could respond, Rachel appeared in the doorway. They're done with the ECMO placement. Lily's stable. You can see her. The next hours passed in a strange suspension of time. Lily lay in her specialized bed, tiny body connected to the bypass machine through cannulas in her neck, monitors displaying the machine's work in numbers and graphs. But her oxygen saturation was rising. Her color was better. The desperate struggle for each breath had eased. She's tolerating it well, the ECMO specialist told them during rounds. If she continues improving at this rate, we might be able to start weaning in a week. A week? 7 more days of machines breathing and pumping for her daughter. 7 more days of uncertainty and hope and the terrible waiting that defined life in the NICU. But Lily was alive, fighting, winning, one small victory at a time. Evelyn spent that week making decisions that would define the rest of her life. She met with FBI agents and her attorney, with Marco present, and answered every question they had about DeLuca Industries' finances. She provided documentation of the restructuring, evidence of Marco's cooperation, testimony about the transition from criminal enterprise to legitimate business. You understand that testifying puts you at risk, Agent Rodriguez warned. The families you're implicating won't take this lightly. I understand that staying in Chicago puts me at more risk, Evelyn countered. Marco is offering federal protection and relocation. That's more security than I'd have if I refused to cooperate. Rodriguez studied her carefully. You're choosing him. Over safety, over independence, over everything you said you wanted when we first approached you. I'm choosing a future where my daughter doesn't grow up afraid, where I don't spend every day looking over my shoulder. If that means cooperating with your investigation and relocating to Portland with Marco's organization, then that's what I'm choosing. Evelyn met the agent's eyes steadily. Is there anything else you need from me? The federal case against the Chicago families moved forward with Marco's testimony and Evelyn's financial documentation. Warrants were issued. Arrests were made. Anthony Castellano, Salvatore Moretti, and 24 others were charged with racketeering, money laundering, and conspiracy. Thomas Keller delivered the news during a meeting in the hospital cafeteria, his expression carefully neutral. The prosecutions will take months, possibly years, but with Marco's cooperation and your documentation, the cases are strong. The FBI is satisfied they have what they need. He paused. Marco has been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. You're protected under witness relocation protocols. When Lily is released from the hospital, you'll both be moved to Portland under federal supervision until the trials conclude. And after the trials? After the trials, you're free. New identities if you want them, though with Marco's public position as a cooperating witness, hiding might be unnecessary. The family's power will be significantly diminished by prosecutions. Keller's expression softened slightly. You made the right choice, Ms. Carter, for yourself and for your daughter. Evelyn wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that cooperation and relocation were enough to keep them safe. But she'd spent too long analyzing risk to think any choice was without consequences. On Lily's 10th day of life, they began weaning her from ECMO. The process was gradual, reducing the machine's support incrementally while monitoring how her lungs responded. Each successful reduction was a victory. Each setback was terrifying. Rachel stayed through all of it, taking leave from her job in Denver to be present for her sister and niece. The distance that had defined their relationship for 2 years dissolved in the shared purpose of willing Lily to survive. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me, Rachel said during one of the long nights when Lily's progress had stalled and Evelyn was too anxious to sleep. When you got pregnant, when you were dealing with all of this alone, I should have tried harder to stay connected. I pushed you away, Evelyn reminded her. I made it very clear I didn't need anyone's help, and I let you push me away because it was easier than fighting you on it. Rachel's smile was sad. We're both stubborn. Mom always said it would either make us unbreakable or would break us completely. I'm glad we're choosing unbreakable. Me too. Evelyn reached for her sister's hand. Rachel, when we move to Portland, would you consider coming with us? I know it's asking a lot, but Lily's going to need family. I'm going to need family, and you're all I have left. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I was hoping you'd ask. I've already started looking at social work positions in Portland. Turns out they need people who understand trauma and relocation. You'd really uproot your entire life? For you? For Lily? In a heartbeat. Rachel squeezed her hand. Besides, what's the point of having a brilliant sister if I can't leverage her success into a career change? I hear Portland's CFO pays very well. They laughed together for the first time in years, the sound startling in the quiet NICU where everything was usually measured in whispers and beeping monitors. 2 weeks after Lily's birth, they removed the ECMO cannulas. Her lungs had healed enough to handle the work on their own with just ventilator support. 3 days later, they extubated her completely, replacing the breathing tube with a nasal cannula that delivered oxygen without forcing her lungs to work. The first time Evelyn heard her daughter cry, a thin, wavering sound that barely qualified as a cry, but was the most beautiful thing she'd ever heard, she broke down completely. She's breathing on her own, the nurse said, smiling. Your little fighter is doing it all by herself. Marco was there, had been there every day, despite running his business remotely and preparing for federal testimony. He stood beside Evelyn as she held Lily for the first time without tubes and wires, making it feel clinical and temporary. She's perfect, Evelyn whispered, looking at the tiny face that was finally pink and healthy instead of struggling and pale. She's absolutely perfect. Just like her mother, Marco said quietly. Evelyn looked up at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart stutter. Not just concern or professional obligation, but something deeper that she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Marco, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. She took a breath. Are you doing all of this, the relocation, the federal cooperation, the complete restructuring of your life, because it's the right business decision, or because of me and Lily? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the baby in her arms. Does it matter? Yes, it matters. Because if you're making these choices for us, that's a responsibility I never asked you to take on. But if you're making them for yourself, for your own future, I'm making them for all of us. Marco interrupted. I'm making them because watching you hide a pregnancy for 5 months taught me that living in fear isn't living. Because watching Lily fight for every breath showed me that some things are worth more than power or territory or my father's legacy. Because he stopped, then continued more quietly. Because somewhere between hiring you as an auditor and watching you become the strongest person I know, I stopped thinking about you as just an employee. And I needed to build a life where admitting that doesn't put you in danger. Evelyn felt tears burning behind her eyes. I can't promise you anything. I can't promise that I'm ready for a relationship, or that I know how to let someone in, or that I won't panic and try to run when things get hard. I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking if you'll give us, a chance once we're in Portland. Once Lily is healthy and the federal trials are over and we're not in constant crisis mode. Marco's voice was gentle. Just a chance to see if what we've built through all of this can become something more. Before Evelyn could answer, Lily squirmed in her arms and made a sound that wasn't quite crying but was definitely demanding. Marco smiled, reaching out to touch one tiny hand that immediately gripped his finger with surprising strength. "She's got opinions already," he said. "She's my daughter. Of course she has opinions." Evelyn looked down at Lily, at the life she'd created in the middle of chaos and fear and determination not to need anyone. "Okay, when we get to Portland, when things settle down, we'll see. No promises, but we'll see. That's all I'm asking." Lily came home from the hospital 6 weeks after her birth, still tiny but healthy, breathing on her own and eating well enough to gain weight steadily. Home was a temporary apartment in Portland's Pearl District, secured through the Witness Relocation Program, but furnished by Marco's organization to be comfortable rather than just functional. Rachel had arrived 2 weeks earlier, had already found a position with a nonprofit that helped refugees and relocated families rebuild their lives. She'd also already fallen in love with Portland's coffee culture and rainy weather, declaring it superior to Denver in every way. The federal trials began in March, with Marco testifying against former allies and business partners with the same precise focus he'd once used to build his empire. Evelyn provided financial documentation that corroborated his testimony, showing money trails and shell companies and the infrastructure that had supported criminal operations for decades. The media coverage was intense. Marco DeLuca, crime boss turned federal witness, the accountant who'd helped bring down Chicago's underworld. Evelyn hated the attention, but Thomas Keller managed it well, limiting their exposure and emphasizing their cooperation rather than their past associations. By summer, most of the major prosecutions had concluded with convictions. The Castellanos and Morettis were facing decades in prison. The Chicago territories they'd controlled were being absorbed by smaller operations or going legitimate under federal oversight. Marco's business, now officially DeLuca Industries with no mention of import solutions or the complicated past, was thriving. The Oregon facility had opened on schedule. Distribution contracts with major retailers were signed. Revenue was strong and completely defensible under federal scrutiny. Evelyn managed the financial operations from a corner office with views of the Willamette River and photographs of Lily on her desk. She'd hired a team of accountants and financial analysts, building a department that could handle the growing business while allowing her time for the daughter who was developing a personality as strong-willed as Evelyn had predicted. On a Friday evening in August, when Lily was 6 months old and healthy enough that the NICU stay felt like a distant nightmare, Marco appeared at Evelyn's apartment with takeout from the Thai restaurant she'd mentioned liking. "I brought dinner," he said when she opened the door, "and I have a proposition." That sounds ominous, but Evelyn let him in, clearing space on the coffee table that was covered with Lily's toys and baby books. They ate while Lily played on a blanket nearby, grasping at colorful objects and making sounds that might eventually become words. Marco waited until they'd finished eating before pulling out a folder. DeLuca Industries is stable, profitable, completely legitimate. He opened the folder, showing her financial statements she'd helped prepare. "The federal trials are over. The witness protection protocols expire next month. We're free, Evelyn. No more looking over our shoulders. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop." "So what's the proposition?" "I want to expand the business into sustainable manufacturing. Green technologies, renewable materials, products that actually make the world better instead of just generating profit." Marco's enthusiasm was evident. "It's ambitious and it'll require significant capital investment, but the market is there. And more importantly, it's the kind of legacy I want to build. The kind of business my children—" He stopped, correcting himself. "The kind of business the next generation can be proud of." Evelyn studied him carefully. "You said children. Not theoretical future children. What are you really asking me, Marco?" He set down the folder and moved to sit beside her on the couch, close enough that she could see the uncertainty in his eyes that he usually hid so well. "I'm asking if you'll partner with me, not just professionally, but personally. I'm asking if we can build something together. A business, a family, a life that's nothing like what either of us came from." Marco took her hand. "I know you don't believe in promises. I know you're scared of depending on anyone. But Evelyn, we've been through crisis after crisis together. We've survived the FBI and rival crime families and premature labor and federal trials. If we can survive all of that, we can survive anything. You're asking me to marry you. Eventually, maybe, if that's something you want. But right now, I'm just asking if you'll stop treating this as temporary. Stop planning your exit strategy. Stop keeping one foot out the door in case you need to run. His grip tightened on her hand. I'm asking you to choose this. Choose us. Choose building something permanent instead of preparing for everything to fall apart. Evelyn looked at Lily, who had managed to grab her favorite toy and was gnawing on it with the intensity of someone discovering important truths about the world. She thought about the last 8 months, about fear and hiding and the desperate determination to handle everything alone. She thought about Marco showing up at the hospital and refusing to leave, about Rachel flying across the country without hesitation, about the terrifying realization that surviving didn't mean being invulnerable. It meant accepting help from people who showed up when it mattered. I'm not good at this, she said quietly, at letting people in, at trusting that they'll stay. I know, but you're learning. You let Rachel back into your life. You let me be there for Lily's birth. You're already choosing connection over isolation, even if it scares you. What if I fail? What if I panic and try to run when things get hard? Then I'll remind you that you're stronger than your fear, that Lily needs a mother who stays and fights instead of running and hiding, that I'm not going anywhere no matter how hard you push. Marco's voice was gentle but firm. Evelyn, you've spent your whole life analyzing risk and trying to control every variable, but some things can't be controlled. Sometimes you just have to trust that the foundation is strong enough to hold when everything else shifts. She wanted to argue, wanted to list all the logical reasons why this was risky and complicated and potentially disastrous. But logic hadn't kept her safe. Logic hadn't saved Lily. The people who'd shown up and refused to leave, that's what had made the difference. Okay, she said, the word feeling like surrender and victory simultaneously. Okay, I'll stop planning exit strategies. I'll stay. I'll build something with you and see where it goes. Marco smiled, the expression transforming his face from controlled and careful to genuinely happy. That's all I needed to hear. He pulled her into a kiss that felt like promise and possibility, like the beginning of something that had been building since the first time she'd walked into his office and decided that hiding was no longer an option. Lily made a demanding sound from her blanket, and they broke apart laughing. Marco scooped her up, holding her with the ease of someone who'd been practicing, and she grabbed his nose with both tiny hands. Your daughter has excellent timing, he said. Our daughter needs a diaper change, Evelyn corrected, standing to get supplies. And Marco, when you said children plural earlier, were you suggesting Lily needs siblings? Eventually, if you want that. He looked down at the baby in his arms. But maybe we start by surviving the first year before we plan the next one. Wise decision. Evelyn took Lily and headed toward the changing table, then paused. Marco, thank you for not giving up on me even when I was doing everything possible to push you away. I told you before, you're worth fighting for, both of you. He followed her, already part of the evening routine they'd been building without acknowledging it. Besides, where else would I find a CFO who can dismantle criminal financial structures and change diapers with equal competence? Flatterer. But Evelyn was smiling as she said it, as she changed Lily's diaper and handed her back to Marco, as they moved through the small apartment that was starting to feel like home. That night, after Lily was asleep in her crib and Rachel had come over for her weekly visit, and the dishes were done and everything was quiet, Evelyn stood at her window looking at Portland's skyline and thought about futures. A year ago, she'd been hiding a pregnancy and planning to disappear. 6 months ago, she'd been in a hospital watching her daughter fight for life while federal agents demanded cooperation, and Marco offered protection she was terrified to accept. Now she was here. Safe. Building something permanent instead of preparing to run, raising a daughter with her sister's help and Marco's support, working for a business that was legitimate and growing, living a life that felt impossibly far from the fear and isolation that had defined her for so long. It wasn't perfect. Lily still woke up 3 times a night. The business faced challenges that required constant attention. Marco's past occasionally surfaced in news coverage of the trials. Rachel's jokes about being the aunt who spoiled Lily were starting to come true in expensive ways. But it was real, solid, built on foundation of people who'd chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. Marco came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. What are you thinking about? How far we've come? How much has changed? Evelyn leaned back against him. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be standing here with you, with Lily asleep in the next room and my sister living 2 blocks away and a job I actually love, I wouldn't have believed them. And now? Now I'm starting to believe that maybe I don't have to control everything. That maybe trusting people isn't the same as being weak. That maybe family isn't just about who you're born to. It's about who shows up when you need them. Marco kissed the side of her neck. That's a good realization to have. It's terrifying. I know. But you're doing it anyway. That's what makes you brave. They stood together at the window, watching Portland's lights reflect off the river. And Evelyn let herself believe in permanence, in futures that didn't require exit strategies, in love that was earned through crisis and survival instead of promised through easy words. Behind them, Lily stirred in her sleep but didn't wake. In the living room, Rachel's laughter drifted from a phone call with friends in Denver. In the folder on the coffee table, plans for sustainable manufacturing represented a future built on progress instead of past sins. Everything Evelyn had tried to control alone, her pregnancy, her fear, her determination not to need anyone, had fallen apart in the best possible way. What she'd built from those ruins was messy and complicated and real, in ways that spreadsheets and planning could never capture. She'd spent her whole life trusting numbers more than people, but numbers couldn't hold you when you broke down crying. Numbers couldn't show up at a hospital at 3 a.m. because you needed someone to be there. Numbers couldn't choose you every day, through crisis and fear and the terrifying work of building something that mattered. People could do that. The right people, who stayed when leaving would be easier, who fought for you when you were too tired to fight for yourself, who saw your walls and chose to wait patiently until you were ready to let them in. Marco was those people. Rachel was those people. Even Lily, tiny and demanding and completely dependent, was teaching Evelyn that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was the price of connection, and connection was worth every terrifying moment. "I love you," Evelyn said quietly, the words feeling new and true. "I don't know when it happened or how to quantify it in any logical way, but I do. I love you." Marco turned her in his arms, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I love you too. I have for months. I was just waiting for you to catch up." Waiting was probably wise. I'm not easy. No, you're not, but you're worth it. He kissed her, slow and deep and full of promise. "We're going to be okay, Evelyn. All of us. We're going to build something that lasts." For the first time in her life, Evelyn believed him without needing evidence or proof or ironclad guarantees. She believed him because he'd earned that trust through action instead of demanding it through words. Because he'd shown up and stayed and fought for her even when she was pushing him away. And that belief, that trust, was enough to build a future on. In the nursery, Lily slept peacefully, healthy and strong, and completely unaware of how far her mother had come to give her this life. In the apartment down the street, Rachel was already planning the next family dinner and making lists of Portland's best playgrounds for when Lily was old enough to appreciate them. And in the quiet of a summer evening with the city lights glowing and the future stretching ahead with possibility instead of fear, Evelyn Carter finally let herself stop running. She let herself stay. She let herself believe in permanence and partnership and the terrifying, beautiful work of building a family from the ruins of everything she'd tried to control alone. It wasn't the story she'd planned, but it was real, and it was hers. And that made it worth every moment of fear it had taken to get here.